first event for December, Imperialism's Blood Libel, Western Propaganda Against Us All. And thank you for everyone who's watching on the stream. So this event actually is a part of a series where Ahmed talks to us about parts of his research on counter-revolutionary thought and counter-insurgency. And he's sharing with us today some insights on Western propaganda and how lies, false information, blood libel works to enable this war machine, this imperialist war machine. So let me say a few words on IDC theory. We've been working for over a year right now. IDC theory, short for Institute for Decolonizing Theory. And we think of decolonizing theory in two ways. Decolonizing theory itself as our experience in Western academia, as much as we've learned, as much as we appreciate many of the scholarship that we encountered and that formed, it participated in forming our knowledge of decolonization and further our commitment to decolonizing theory. But we were also met with a lot of cynicism in many parts, where we see some hypocrisy at many places that actually becomes even more present right now during the assault on Gaza. Our institution, where Ahmed and I met actually at Columbia University, where we both studied, had recently banned Student Justice for Palestine, a group that both of us also worked with, along with Jewish Voice for Peace, in an attempt to silence pro-Palestine and pro-resistance voices on campuses. There is, on Fox News and all Western media right now, they talk about the rising anti-Semitism on campuses, ignoring the fact that all of these protests have actually made it clear it's an anti-settler colonialism, and including the Jewish Voice for Peace organization, and that have always been, for since its beginning, fighting for this. But we're also seeing a rise in the US in equating anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism, and a bill just passed with just one person voting no to that, including the so-called progressive voices in the US. So this bill has just passed, and to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. So I'm just highlighting how the urgency of this topic that Ahmed will share with us his findings. So we're interested in decolonizing theory in that sense, theory that is taught in a vacuum, as if it's not talking about the real world that we see with our eyes every day. It's theory that is just distant from everyday life. It's theory that talks about colonialism in the past, but refuses to look at colonialism in the present and its different forms. So this is the first meaning of decolonizing theory, but also related to it, we're interested in the theory of decolonization. So the previous legacy of theorists and scholars who advanced theories of decolonialism that was tied with the fight for liberation, the liberation struggles. So I'll move now to introduce Ahmed, my dear friend and the co-founder of IDC theory, who holds his PhD, as I said, from Columbia University, from the Middle East, South Asian and African Studies Department. His dissertation and his research interest also, as I said, he's interested in counter-revolution and counter-insurgency. I was lucky to read his dissertation, which has actually, as the more I go back to it and the more I delve into my own research, I'm seeing its very important insights that actually would affect a lot of discipline. I do cinema studies, and his work on theorizing the crowd and how the counter-revolution looks at the crowd. And you can see it in cinema. I managed to apply it to cinema studies and apply it to analyzing scenes and how the crowd is represented. I think he's working on his manuscript right now, and I'm sure a lot of people and a lot of scholars from different disciplines will see its very relevance to their fields. So I'll leave it here and introducing Ahmed, who, as I said, will talk to us today about imperialism's blood libel and some insights on the history of Western propaganda against us all. Welcome, Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Karim, and thank you for everyone who's here. And indeed, we're going to talk about the crowd. Part of what we're going to talk about is definitely about the crowd. I'm going to be speaking in English, but in the Q&A feel free to ask in Arabic. هتكلم دلوقتي بالإنجليزي بس في الأسئلة اللي عايز يسأل بالعربي أهلا وسهلا. So we're going to talk about propaganda. I'm not going to, my aim is not going to be trying to debunk the lies or prove or refute them, but actually to dissect the logic or the lack of logic or the racist history that makes these lies possible. But let me start by a quote from William Shakespeare. And I'm sharing something by Shakespeare, not only because I like Shakespeare, but also, and not only because it describes propaganda in a very eloquent and clear way, but also because I think Shakespeare, as a critical writer, can be very easily appropriated for anti-colonial thought, anti-authoritarian thought, anti-capitalism, and even feminism, even anti-patriarchy. Don't let the liberals lie to you about Shakespeare. But this quote, I think, describes very vividly what has been happening in the last month or so. Open your ears, for which of you will stop the vent of hearing when loud rumor speaks? And rumor here is equivalent to propaganda. In the context of the play, it's at the beginning of Henry the Fourth's war against his enemies in many camps. So it is about propaganda. It's about wartime propaganda and how propaganda is invasive. You can't shut your ears towards propaganda. And then rumor or propaganda is speaking. Upon my tongues, continual slanders ride. The which in every language I pronounce, stuffing the ears of men with false reports. So it's not about the veracity, it's about the repetition of the rumor. I speak of peace, while covert enmity under the smile of safety wounds the world. Now, I think this describes very clearly and very honestly what the Western media has been doing in the last few months, or month and a few days. The night before the genocidal war on Gaza started, Western media, reputable Western media outlets, started spreading the lie that the Palestinian resistance decapitated babies in the settlements they raided. And like the rumor in Shakespeare's lines, this lie spread without the need to verify. People were not able to shut their ears. No one could stop the vent of hearing when loud rumor spoke. And of course, as I was saying, no one needed verification. It just needed the story to be repeated. And then the next day, many of these reporters started saying that, oh no, we didn't have enough proof. Maybe we were too hasty in reporting that. Maybe, or we didn't say that this happened. We said that there were reports that this happened, but the damage was done. That's the point of propaganda, that the story is being repeated regardless of whether it would be verified or not. So this is the kind of propaganda, the kind of strategies we're going to be talking about. And obviously, now obviously we're talking about lies. We're talking about strategic lies, lies that are being strategized to service the genocide. And in that sense, Western media, it's not that they misspoke or that they ignored or forgot about the rules of their job. They were actually serving propaganda, whether intentionally or not. I'm not interested in intentions here, but they were doing their job in servicing imperialism and spreading the lies that imperialism needs them to serve. So this could be the end of the story, simply that these are lies and they service the interests of the empire, and that's it. And we don't need further justification for that. However, when I'm saying that I want to look into the logic and the history and so forth, it's not to look for excuses for the people who were spreading these lies, but actually to think of two very related things. One of them is the kind of imagination that creates these horrible lies and imagery, and what kind of sick people come up with these images. And this has to do with the history of Western colonialism and Western racism more broadly. The other thing is how these things become believable. And again, there's a short answer that okay, the people who spread these lies and those who believe them are racist. But then there is also a logic of how these ideas have been normalized, or how these images have been normalized to the extent that people wouldn't question them. So the first item on the list, and I'm going to be covering a number of themes, and then in the Q&A, you can ask me to elaborate more on these themes. While I'm talking, Karim, please feel free to interrupt and ask me to elaborate. I'll be jumping from one theme to another. So the first, from the title of this talk, Imperialism's Blood Libel. For those of you who don't know, the term blood libel belongs to the history of European anti-Semitism. And one of the most horrible lies that Europe has devised against its Jewish population was that the atrocious claim that that the Jewish people would kill Christian babies and use their blood as part of their religious rituals. And of course, this comes from a very racist and anti-Semitic imagination, but also it served as a justification for the dehumanization and then the oppression of Jews in Europe. So when we see the story of the beheading of babies, we see how this blood libel is being mobilized against the Palestinians. And here the idea that the spilling of blood is kind of connected to the religious rituals of the population in question. So in the case of the original blood libel, it had to do with connecting this bloodthirst to the Jewish festivities. And here in the recent example, the stressing on decapitation, on beheading, it has to do with referencing the ritual of Islamic slaughter, Islamic animal slaughter, obviously, but also it has to do with a series of images connected to ISIS specifically about decapitation. So it serves also the lie that Hamas is ISIS, which is ridiculous, of course. So here there is the production of a certain savagery that is Islamic in the minds of those who spread it. Of course, this goes against the empirical history that tells us that actually it was France that was the Republic of Decapitation in the 19th and 20th century, and including, of course, the guillotine that was the official French execution instrument, but also how in Algeria and other places, but that's an obvious example how French colonialism delighted in decapitating its enemies, and not only decapitating them, but stealing their heads and keeping them in museums or studying them, and so on. And of course, our mentor Joseph Massad wrote about that, about how the decapitation has been a French tradition, but now they want to show or to claim that there is something Islamic about decapitation. So here we see how these imageries come together in creating this lie about Palestinians decapitating babies. And here also, since we're talking about the blood libel, there is a lot to add here about how the Israeli has become the anti-Semite. Not only that, Israel is using anti-Semitic logic against the Palestinian population, but how the Zionist project from the start has been about accepting the stereotypes that, or some of the stereotypes that Europe held against the Jews, but then arguing that through colonization, the weak Jew in their mind, the diasporic Jew, will be transformed into a strong Jew that is similar to the European colonizer. That was very clear in the discourse of the founders of the Zionist movement, whether labor Zionism or the right-wing revisionist Zionism. And again, for those of you who are interested, two very interesting sources on that is Joseph Massad's The Persistence of the Palestinian Question. He talks about it in some of the chapters. And more comprehensively, Michael Seltzer's The Aryanization of the Jewish State. But I don't want to get caught up on the question of the transformation of anti-Semitism. There's also literature about how, for the modern West, the Muslim becomes the new Semite. So the Muslim is accused of anti-Semitism, but is the victim of anti-Semitism at the same time. Again, this is something we can come back to in the Q&A if anyone is interested. But let's talk about the imagery of the blood ritual, or of blood libel beyond anti-Semitism. Now, beyond the specific history of anti-Semitism, something akin to the blood libel has operated in Western imagination of the colonized crowds, especially as they erupt in anti-colonial uprising. So the imagery of a blood ritual, of a savage, or of an orgy of blood, I'm going to use the term a lot, the term orgy a lot. Feel free to interrogate me on that term. Some of my research has to do with that. But we will come to that later. So this imagination of resistance as a blood ritual is something that keeps coming back, keeps resurfacing in the colonial archive about uprisings. And if you look, for example, at the 1622 raid by the Powhatan Confederacy, the Native American alliance against the colony of Virginia, or the 1643 attack by the Lenape against the Dutch settlers in New Amsterdam, which later became New York, or the founding part of New York, you would find the same imagery of bloodthirsty native reveling in the blood of their victims, decapitating children, raping women, and all that. So you see these kinds of imagery as part of the colonial imaginary, even though it was so now it is documented, we know that these settlers were the ones systematically committing a genocide. But there is, as if there is a hierarchy of violence, that, okay, genocidal violence is something that is strategic and instrumental and civilized, but then there is this anti-civilized or not uncivilized revelry in blood and decapitation and rape and so on. And especially with the case of the 1622 raid on the colony of Virginia, the main source for that raid, or for the massacre that's supposed to have happened, is John Smith, who actually wasn't there when it happened. So it's exactly like Biden when he confirmed something he hadn't seen. And the language he used is very slippery. He said, I never imagined that I would have confirmed. So even the sentence is grammatically incorrect, or it doesn't make sense. But then it creates something in the mind of the audience. I couldn't imagine to have confirmed images of decapitated babies. So he didn't say that he confirmed seeing decapitated babies, but he confirmed by not confirming. And this is also something that we see in the colonial archive with incidents like the 1622 raid on the colony of Virginia. And it has to do with this imagination of the natives as bloodthirsty, but also of the kind of savagery they indulge in as something that is confirmed by not confirming it, because of the presumptions that they're savages, but also because their horrible savagery is something we cannot look at. So it is by virtue of it being unconfirmed that it becomes confirmed as something horrible. And that's the logic of the orgy, or what I call the orgiastic paradox. And we can come back to that later. Now, to move to another example.
Can you hear me?
Are you saying something?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment about this orgy of blood, or also to relate it to the first question you asked us, or what you will talk today about. First, what kind of sick imagination comes up with this, and the second question is how many people get to believe these, specifically in this case of like bloodthirsty savages. I just wanted to comment, I think a word that could tie these two parts is projection, like how many this is the way they knew control of land came through, and this is what they project on resistance, because that's what they think land back means, or this is their only way of imagining how one can relate to a land. This is, of course, in cinema, we see that since the beginning of like Hollywood with Western movies, and you see always the Indian speaking nonsensical just sounds, making sounds and attacking the white settlement out of nowhere. Like that is the logic of the film. You're identifying with this community that is living, and out of nowhere you have all of those Indian savages like attacking them. And very interesting, even in the white liberal mentality today, even when they want to counter this image, films like Avatar, which is allegedly is telling a story of an indigenous resistance, film like Scorsese, which I actually just watched yesterday, even the name of the film, Killers of the Flower Moon, they're showing savage white, what they call white trash, like like white folks who don't have properties or money, and they are the savages who are attacking like a native in the Indian tribe for their oil and land. But I'm interested of how the aesthetics of Avatar, for example, or Killers of the Flower Moon, it's the white people here who are killers of the flower moon, not like very symbolic nature thing. So how these dehumanization tropes, how the aesthetics of that, even when they try to counter it, you still watch the same aesthetics of a sci-fi film, which has its roots in this colonial imagination. How do you see an anti-Western today, or a revisionist Western like Scorsese's, but also showing exactly the same aesthetics and the same imagination of early colonial films? Like even when they try to challenge these discourses, you see the aesthetics are just action, blood, like filled movies. And I just wanted to comment on this.
Yes, thank you, Karim. So yes, there is definitely the element of they know that they've done these things or similar things, like the imperialists know that this is their mode of action. So part of it is the fear that what they did is going to be done to them. So their imagination comes, like this is where these images come from. And then they're surprised, that they're kind of disappointed when they see that the oppressed are actually more merciful and more humane than they thought. And
but I would also add they have turned it into aesthetics. That's, I think, where it was going with the sci-fi film and the Western movies. They have turned the rumor, if we are to use the Shakespeare quote, they have turned the rumor into an aesthetic that is just believable now. We've seen it so many times, even if it's not in movies, it's in news reporting. So it becomes an aesthetic that you can challenge facts, but you cannot challenge like aesthetics. You just see it. You cannot unsee it. Well,
Definitely. And actually,
it's more
you got me thinking
difficult
now. Sorry.
or it's more difficult to challenge aesthetics. I don't mean you can't.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that that you got me thinking about, and it came to my mind a few times when I was looking at examples of propaganda, is how like this narrative of people who are stuck somewhere in a settlement, one way or another, a settlement, and something that is indigenous, that comes from the land, is attacking them, and they feel threatened in their like hyper urban spaces, and then this something that they can't understand is coming to attack them, is actually the theme or the aesthetic of the horror genre. Uh, and and maybe this has to do with like Hollywood, how the horror genre comes from a settler society, or a colonial settler society. So this is the repository of imagination. They have the land or the natives or something that's coming from the land attacking this urban setting, especially that in many examples, it's either a house that's built on an Indian graveyard, a Native American graveyard, or people who arrived somewhere, so newly arrived somewhere, so new settlers, and then something not understandable that's coming from the land, haunting and attacking them. And maybe this somehow serviced the the propaganda surrounding the October 7 attack, because in some cases it seemed to me that the propaganda is recounting this theme more than that it's trying to look at what happened or may have happened in October 7.
Yeah, it becomes an already made image. Like, I actually want to, on the point of horror, I will also add, in cinema studies, we look at zombie movie, like in the 60s, where the 60s was the last decade where the Western cowboy movies was trendy. It just died out as a genre after the 60s. And interestingly, the 70s, you start seeing space movies where the Western front or the frontier of colonialism has moved and the aliens are now the Indians. You also start seeing shark movies, all of those vacationers, people on vacation, and then there's a shark attack on the peaceful shore. Also, zombies appeared in 68, or the imagination of this nature or even science going wrong, attacking. So yeah, it's very interesting how the Indian presence kind of disappeared, and then it became all of these forces of nature. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and we talked about zombies before, you a lot of times, you and I, Karim. And the zombie genre started after the first U.S. military intervention in Haiti, and it had to do with their fear of Haitian people, the Haitian uprisings, but also of Haitian magic. And then this is how they cooked up the idea or the genre of the zombie. Now, my next example actually fits very well with what you were saying, Karim. So I was going to talk about scalping. And this is something that has been popularized by cinema, by also pop literature on Native Americans. Even though not all nations or not all tribes of the Americas practiced scalping before the colonization of the Americas. But we see like it's something that keeps coming up in these kinds of reports that, again, like the reports I was talking about, that depicts massacres committed by the Native Americans against settlements rather than resistance operations. And then they would gratuitously use the term scalping. They scalped everyone. And this always raises the question. So we know that not all of the Indian tribes or the or nations practiced scalping. So why does the term keep coming up? So if we look at actually the history of the practice, we see that yes, even though it was a practice for some of the Native American tribes or nations, it was actually the Dutch settlers that turned it into an institutional practice because of bounty hunting, because they wanted uh, hired killers to kill as many Native Americans as possible, and sometimes also kill other settlers, like the competing settlers. They would pay the killers, who were sometimes Native Americans hired by the Dutch, not exclusively, but sometimes. They would pay them once they show the scalps of the people they killed. So here scalping is transformed from something that, yes, some tribes practiced to a large institution because of the settlers. But then we see how the settlers keep accusing the natives that they're the one who engage in this savage practice. And it's interesting also that when I was looking into that, the Daily Mail, which is one of the British newspapers that is playing a role right now in spreading the lies and blood libels against the Palestinian people without any proof, just because they can't say it, has also in the recent years published an article insisting that the Native Americans practiced scalping. So it's the imperialist propaganda is consistent as far as the Daily Mail is concerned. Let me jump to another example that also has an element of the kind of projection that Karim is talking about. So part of my research looked at the colonial encounter here in Egypt, how it was covered, how it was imagined, and so on. So I came across a very interesting 1919 document. We recently had a theatrical workshop in which we tried to dramatize this document. And we're planning another version of that soon. But anyway, the document is about a riot or a resistance operation that happened during the Egyptian uprising or Egyptian revolt of 1919. And even though it seems to me that this was a highly organized attack, because they were able to ambush the inspector of prisons, the British inspector of prisons, and kill him. So it seems like something very targeted and that needed planning in order to know exactly where he was traveling and ambush him and so on. But in the British colonial reports, this incident becomes a bloody incident of like men screaming and women بيزغرطوا. The term back then was luluing, and now they use the term ululations. But anyway, it's the idea that the indigenous screams. There is this again an indescribable orgy, as the document calls it. It seems to have been an indescribable orgy. The document claims, and also there is the imagery of people tearing down the British colonials by their bare hands. So there is an element of like horror, Victorian Gothic in that. And then not only tearing them down with their own hands, but drinking the blood that is gushing from their veins. And of course, I mean, if it's about Orientalist tropes and stereotypes and so on, and the savage Muslim crowd and the screaming Allahu Akbar and so on, then they must remember that also consuming blood, including animal blood, is prohibited in Islamic law or in Islamic practice. Whereas it is the British cuisine that uses animal blood as an ingredient. So we wonder what kinds of projections are there, and including, of course, the projection of violence. We know that in 1882, the British bombed Alexandria. It was one of the largest massacres in Egyptian modern history. And after the bombardment, or as a result of the bombardment, parts of the city caught fire. But the British reports are all about the natives going mad and setting fire to their buildings, the natives going around looking for Christians, meaning Europeans, to kill. So again, in the face of the very evident colonial violence, we see reports of savage native violence so that it doesn't get recorded as resistance. Now, how much of this is conscious, how much of this is unconscious, I'm not sure. I don't think, like psychoanalytically, it is repression per se, it is a projection per se, because for projection, you need some kind of repression. I don't think the people who commit these crimes have a consciousness to begin with, like they know that they are committing these crimes. But there's a mechanism that is similar to projection, where they accuse the others, or they accuse their victims of what they are doing. And we see this even with the rape allegations. Now we're going to come to that later, but we must also remember that it is documented. We know that Israel has been using rape as a tool of terror. It used it as a tool of terror in 1948 to terrorize Palestinian populations into escaping. We know that it has instrumentalized sexual violence as a torture method, as a blackmail method, and still they accuse the Palestinian resistance in the absence of any solid proof that this is something they do. And there is the presumption that we must believe that when they against the lack of evidence, when they say that the Palestinians do it, because of course the Palestinians are savages. But when we talk about sexual violence in Israeli prisons, it's something that is documented, but it doesn't become part of the conversation. The same way that we know that during the US imperial wars, whether in Vietnam, whether in Iraq, whether in Afghanistan, whether in other places, rape has been used as a method, again, of torture, or just because there is nothing to deter the US soldiers from committing it, so including rape against children and killing the children after they rape them. And all of this is documented, but then the imperialist media is actually accusing the Palestinian resistance of engaging in this kind of behavior, and always with the presumption that we must believe because these people are savages, this is what they do.
Yeah, I'm seeing it so far as a trope. The word changes, but the logic is similar, whether it's French versus Algeria, that's decapitation, Palestinians versus Zionists, it's beheading. Well, we know how many kids were beheaded in the bombardments. And yesterday in a protest in New York, as we were chanting, how many kids have you killed today? That was one of the chants. It was very uncanny. There was a Zionist supporter walking next to us chanting at us, rapists and children murderers. As we are condemning Israel for killing that many children, someone just had the audacity and courage to come up with us with these allegations and yell at us, and in a very terrorizing way, actually, like attack on a group of people who were protesting and standing. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and two things related to what you just said, Karim. One phrase that appeared in the pro-Palestine social media recently is that every Zionist accusation is a confession. And this is true because, just like we were saying, rape is actually something that Israel has been systematically using against the Palestinians. The stories about like cutting people down to pieces, whether it be decapitating children or killing pregnant women after killing their babies, so opening their bellies and killing the babies and then killing them. It's things that we know, it's documented that they happened in 1948 during the massacres that founded the State of Israel. And including the story that babies were put in ovens and left to burn, which also the Israelis claimed the resistance did. And we know that actually this happened in Deir Yassin. The Zionist militias did that in Deir Yassin. So we see this kind of, again, it's not literally projection, but it's projection in the sense that, yes, they're accusing their victims of what they did. The other element is the dehumanization, of course, that they can, like a Zionist rally in the US can call the pro-Palestinian crowd baby killers, they can call them rapists, they can call them savages. We got called savages many times when we were protesting in the US. Because of this dehumanization, because basically, to put it in very simple terms, because they are white and we are not. Now, on the question of dehumanization, we must also remember that, like when we say that the Israeli army does this and that, or when we say the Zionist militias did this and that, we don't stop at saying that this is monstrous. Of course, it is monstrous, and looking for a logic is not a way to justify what the crimes that are being committed. But it's also important to remember that in 1948 and in 2023, this excessive bloodletting by the Israeli militias back then, the Israeli army right now, also serves a purpose. They want to terrorize the Palestinian population into leaving their lands. And that's important when studying like colonial violence. But it's when we look at it the other way around, the imperialist depiction of anti-colonial violence, it's always deprived of logic, and this lends support to these exaggerated, dehumanizing imagery and tropes and so on. So we see that very clearly with the Western or the imperialist imagination of what happened on October 7th. There is this, again, the orgy of blood that exceeds logic. So, I mean, we should ask ourselves if we don't know what happened, if we can accept that maybe, I'm not saying that I'm accepting that, but even if we say that maybe what the imperialists are saying is true, then we must ask why. Why would Hamas do this and that? And of course, in the imperialist logic, they do this and that because they're savages. Not because of any logic, battlefield logic, because the battlefield logic would undermine these claims. If they are on the run, if they are in a sort of guerrilla confrontation with the Israeli army, then what would they have the time to decapitate babies, to rape women, to make sure that everyone is being killed on their way? This doesn't make sense. And this also extends to like the claim, again, the Israeli claim that they found manuals with the Palestinians, with the Palestinian resistance fighters, with certain instructions. And these instructions included kill as many people as you can and take as many captives as you can. Now, it can't be both. It has to be one of them. You can't kill as many people as you can and take as many captives as you can. But the idea, I mean, the imagery itself or the tropes have to exceed logic. So when the Israeli war machine fabricates something like that, like the claim of finding these manuals, the violence they're depicting needs to exceed logic, and therefore it can carry contradictory things or contradictory predicaments like that. but to look at
Yeah.
another facet of this
I
dehumanization. Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight another trope I'm seeing from what you're saying, if I may. This they decapitated babies because they're savage, and they're savage because they decapitated babies. Like this is just the extent of the October 7 in a vacuum, right? This is kind of what would be put in the news, and in fact what happened. And I heard this also in previous examples you gave, while the allegation and the logic justifying it are actually one and the same. They're not, like, it's not a logic for they're just, as I said, they both kind of say the same thing. They decapitate babies, they're savages, and there's no context of what the resistance operation actually is. Hostage for hostage exchange, for example. In previous examples you brought, this attack on the trains in Egypt, which actually, after we did the drama workshop, I've seen similar examples of attack on trains in Palestine exactly around the same time in 1917, 1918. So that, it seems to me that that was not a sink of like orgy of blood sinking and all over the falling Ottoman Empire or like Egypt and Palestine. It seems to me that it was like an organized resistance of some sort. But when you read the coverage in the British, it's just, again, an orgy of blood. Savages attack the train fall. And there's no analysis of how this is an attack on colonial routes of trade routes and infrastructure and the trains that are stitching the empire together. It's a very organized attack, resistance attack against these, and that, I guess, sabotaging the train lines, having hostage. This is also something we know from history, that taking civilians as hostages, that's something that Israel actually was pioneering in history. So it's when, like, what I'm trying to say is, like, they're savages because that's why they do this, but there's kind of insistence, and that's my question. Is it a planned insistence to hide the tactical aspect behind, or like behind the operations or these operations? Because once you do that, you're just painting them as savages, as you said, but you're also inciting a discourse that these savages cannot build strategies and strategize an attack or a counter insurgency or an insurgency, right? This kind of, it rids them from any military strategy and just dehumanizes them into just savages who do this. So is it a planned trope? Is this trope a planned attempt to hide resistance strategies and how resistance could be, in fact, in many cases, a sophisticated attack that was well planned and organized? Or is it just a manifestation of the racism and the trope? Like, is the trope well planned to hide all of these, or is it just like a unconscious expression?
Mhm. Yeah, of course, I don't know for fact, so I'm going to guess. But my guess is that it's both. So there are these like manifestations or psychological reflexes of a deep-seated racism that keeps coming up. So that's one thing. And then there are powers that know how to instrumentalize these racist assumptions or tropes, um, at least recently. So we know, for example, that there's something that's called the hasbara, or the explanation in Hebrew, which is the state-sponsored campaign sponsored by the State of Israel to explain the acts of Israel. So there's a global propaganda campaign that uh, that rests on trying to justify anything Israel does, and on the other hand, to demonize and dehumanize the Palestinians. And we know for a fact that this is something that, like, a global campaign that is being funded by the State of Israel. And we see, like, on social media, how there's usually a line of thought that many Zionists would follow. So like they would spread the same lies at the same time, and there would be no evidence uh, for the lies they're spreading, but because they're spreading it at the same time, and most of them are lies that had to do with the dehumanization or the demonization of the Palestinian people, the resistance, but through it, the entire Palestinian population, and and this reflects the existence of a planned campaign. But another thing that we don't know for sure, but now I'm guessing and speculating, that we know that there are public relations companies that are specialized in propaganda campaigns. They are specialized in rebranding governments, social movements, and we know, for example, that Saatchi and Saatchi did lots of work in Lebanon to push forward a certain political faction. And they created like slogans and imagery and so on. So maybe there is an element of that. So when we see, for example, that the videos that came out from the side of the resistance showing the prisoners that are being released, the Israeli prisoners that are being released, and many of them were very happy, many of them greeting the resistance, and even the ones that didn't look very happy actually didn't look like they suffered the way we see the imagery of the Palestinians who are coming out of Israeli prisons, and we see the signs of torture. And so, for example, the child who had both his hands broken by the Israelis, and who was refused treatment and then was treated after he was released. So we have these images coming out from the Palestinian side, or from mainly from the resistance. But then we see how the Israeli propaganda is picking these images of Israelis to further humanize them at the expense of the Palestinians. So the image of the Israeli prisoner who was released with her dog, for example, stops being a story about how the Palestinian resistance allowed one of the captives to keep her dog, and it becomes a story about the humanity of this Israeli settler that the Palestinians can't understand. So it's the dog versus the Palestinians, or the pet, the woman and her pet versus the Palestinians. And this has to do with, again, the humanization, dehumanization, what white imperialism sees as human, and how like not only in the settler colony, not only in the settler colony of Israel, but globally, imperialism would identify with certain images as human. So I'm guessing that there is some work of public relations companies there, but we're going to see in the near future. Now, let me move to, because we have so many other themes that I want to cover. I'll move quickly to the theme of fire, how this humanization of the settler war machine versus the dehumanization of the resistance also operates on the level of fire. So when Israel attacked the Baptist hospital, and against the lack of any proof to the Israeli claim, Israel claimed that this was actually a misfiring Palestinian missile, and the Western media ran off with the story. A few days later, they said that there is no proof, but they're still using it as the accepted story. And again, this brings us back to how propaganda works, or the rumor in Shakespeare's lines, how it's about spreading the lie and not waiting for confirmation, because by the time it would be proven as false, it would have spread as a rumor and people would have accepted it. Uh, so there is that, but also in order um, to accept this story, you need to have in your mind from the beginning an assumption about the hierarchy of fire. So even the hierarchy of humanity reflects on fire. How Israeli fire is precise and strategic and purposeful and so on, whereas the Palestinian fire is primitive. It it's likely to misfire. The missile can fall and destroy the Palestinians themselves, and this has to do with again how fire, because fire is imagined as man's first invention. So that's part of my research also, how there is a hierarchy of fire in the Western imagination. And this hierarchy of fire reflects a hierarchy of humanity. So in many different representations, we see that only the white man or the white state, which embodies the privilege of the white man, can master fire. But then other populations, including women, children, and non-Europeans, according to this imperialist understanding, cannot master fire. And so in the war on terror, for example, the so-called war on terror, we see the strategic missiles of the superpowers against the self-emulating terrorists. So the savage who cannot even master fire, his fire consumes him. He blows himself up or herself up. And this goes again against any statistics of whether like the insurgent groups or even the terrorists have used suicide bombing as their method or other methods, like how prevalent were suicide bombings among insurgent and or terrorist organizations. That's not important. The important, like Karim said, it becomes an aesthetic. It becomes a visual that keeps being repeated, and it's rooted in this understanding that the Western state is something that has the faculty of thinking and planning and so on. So we have smart bombs, whereas the others cannot control themselves, cannot control their fire. Now, I have lots of historical examples about that. We can come back to that in the Q&A if anyone is interested. But I will move to an unlikely
Just want to
example.
mention quickly,
Sorry? Yeah.
one of the most recent examples, The Guardian just posted an article 23 hours ago about how this current war on Gaza, actually, it's Israel's first time to rely on AI to select bomb targets just to prevent civilian death. And obviously, if they want to blame this on AI, it's obviously not working. So it's like that's what they're saying. It's to select bomb. You can Google it. It's a Guardian article. So this AI.
Yes, and by the way, the US also did something similar with its drone attacks, especially in Pakistan. So there is, yes, the hiding behind technology. And then we have a paradox here because they claim that, like the imperialists, whether it's US imperialism or the Israeli extension of imperialism, they claim that their fire is smart and targeted and so on. And we see them killing civilians en masse. So uh, if if uh, if their fire is that targeted and they're killing civilians, then they are 100% guilty of the premeditated murder of civilians. Whereas if the insurgent fire is indiscriminate, savage, cannot aim or cannot discriminate between different targets, then they can't hold the insurgents accountable for civilian deaths. Because now I'm not saying that civilian deaths are not a tragedy. I mean, but even the resistance understands that for anyone to lose loved ones is something that is worthy of grief and so on. So I'm not buying into Judith Butler's claim that by supporting Palestine or the Palestinian resistance, we're against the right to grief. On the contrary, even our enemies have the right to grief. And that's something that doesn't take away from the cause. But what I'm saying is, if we follow their logic, the imperialist logic, that the imperialist fire can be aimed and the insurgent fire cannot be aimed, then it follows that when imperialists kill civilians, they can be blamed for killing civilians because their fire is targeted. When insurgents kill civilians, according to the imperialist logic, they should not be held accountable because they don't have the faculty of aiming their fire. Now, of course, the whole logic is flawed and racist, but I'm saying that this follows from their logic, and it reveals a paradox in their logic, where the targeted fire is actually not guilty of the civilians it kills. They become collateral damage, whereas the unaimed fire is guilty of the civilians it kills. But also on the theme of fire, so I was saying that this racialized hierarchy of fire is also gendered, and it's interesting that when the Israeli army, now the Israeli army, of course, is no stranger to bombing civilians, and in some cases to killing, like there is the Hannibal directive that better than allow the enemy to take hostages, kill the enemy and the hostage. So we know that this is something the Israeli army practices. But then during the recent events, so on October 7th or 8th, when the Israeli army decided to indiscriminately bomb the kibbutzim of Hulit and Safa, I think the other one, they sent an untrained force of all women. What do they call it? Like a tank brigade, an all women tank brigade, and they were untrained, and they ordered them to shell these two kibbutzes. Now, so we see how even in their state practice, and then they marketed this as feminist. It's the first tank, all-female tank brigade in the world. So it's something feminist that now women are taking part in genocidal wars. But if we look deeper, even on the video, I can send the link for the video in the chat. It was by the Israeli propaganda machine. It's called ITV. Now there is something striking about how in this video there is an older male leader and then the women surrounding him. So even in this like liberal feminist marketing of the female Israeli soldier, there is patriarchy at the center. But also it's interesting how when they decided to use this kind of licentious or like uncontrolled fire, they sent female soldiers to do it. So it shows how this like the sexist hierarchy that extends to fire is dominant in the Israeli military mentality. And I have other examples from earlier, but this is the recent most striking example. Now, let me jump to something else, and maybe this will be the last thing I talk about, so we can open up for the Q&A. Now, we see how the Israeli army weaponizes, or imperialism in general, weaponizes white feminine sexuality in the service of imperialist and genocidal wars. Part of it is all the hype about the female soldiers in the IDF, and there is something about the TikTok images. And a few years ago, the calendar of semi-naked IDF soldiers, female IDF soldiers, and this was one of the earlier appearances of Gal Gadot. So we see this like mobilization of white female sexuality as part of the imperialist war effort. But then, of course, another way white feminine sexuality has been typically mobilized in racist and colonial projects is creating the image or producing women, white women, as vulnerable and as sexually available, and therefore always as a victim or a potential victim of rape by other populations, and therefore fueling colonial violence or nationalist racist violence through this predicament to protect the women. So it claims to be feminist, but also it's very masculinist in that sense. And this ties up with a genre or a theme of the damsel in distress. Let me catch my breath for a moment and ask you to Google the term damsel in distress and see what images come up. And then I will continue. Okay, now, uh, of course, the idea of a damsel in distress has to do, of course, with heroism as something that is masculine. So there's always a woman to be rescued. But if you can notice from the images, usually the the damsel in distress is strikingly white. Now, of course, there's more multiculturalism in the visual culture of the U.S., but historically, especially in Hollywood, and other uh, media of cultural production, a strikingly white woman that is in danger, and usually in danger by something that is not white. So here, the image of the famous image of King Kong. So a strikingly white woman is being victimized by this non-white creature. So these images are part of the Western visual culture, and it's part of imperialism, part of the imperialist fantasy of saving the women. So it's usually protecting the women. And let me share with you another image. Um, Uh, this is from an article by Joshi Preeti. It's called uh, Mutiny Echoes. And it's actually about A Tale of Two Cities. It's about how the Indian uprising or mutiny of 1857 is reflected in A Tale of Two Cities. Uh, and one of the things the author analyzes is this imagery of the uprising, the Indian uprising, as victimizing England, and England metonymized as a vulnerable woman. So the idea of anti-colonial uprising or anti-colonial violence as a threat to women, and then fighting against the colonized as protecting women. So here we see the Bengali tiger attacking a woman and her child. Um, and there's a hint of rape. The woman's clothes are torn, so uh, it highlights the vulnerable femininity of the British victim, but also there's an element of rape. And then the English lion is coming to the rescue. So we see how that has been part of the colonial imagery. And this, of course, has to do also with uh, first crowds understood as a threat to individuality. So the individual female who, in the Western imperialist thought, needs to be ensconced in the domestic, in the both meanings of the term, the domestic as in the country, the homeland, and the domestic as in the household. And then out of that, she is at threat, and this threat resonates with the threat of the colonized. And then this understanding of the colonized as always savage, brutal, potentially rapists. And historically, this has operated like in the experience of anti-Black racism, for example, in the American South. Part of it was about the idea, the understanding of Black masculinity as predatory, as the Black man is always a potential rapist, and therefore the racist violence against Black people is aimed to protect white women from the rape. There are even studies, and Frantz Fanon mentions that how the lynching of Black people in the American South betrays a castration fantasy. They want to neutralize the sexual threat of the Black man. Of course, it's never reducible to that. There are other elements, but there is this understanding of the non-white as pathological, predatory, and so on. Now, again, in the last 50 or so years, there has been the production of the Arab or the Muslim as always potentially a rapist. And that's why, again, a white crowd can pass by a brown or colored or multi-ethnic or the important thing, a pro-Palestine crowd, and call the people there rapists. It has to do with this tradition of producing the other, especially recently the Arab and the Muslim, as a potential rapist. And we see that very clearly in on social media, for example, the stories that the unverified, obviously, stories by some, again, some of them unverified accounts, we don't know who they are on social media, about rape during the October attacks. And there is an emphasis on the Muslims, when the Muslims finished rape, they saw, and even claims about fatwas that the insurgents or the fighters had with them that justified rape in combat. And again, as someone who is somehow familiar with Islamic jurisprudence, I can tell you there are no such fatwas at all. But again, this betrays the racist logic that it's about emphasizing their cultural and racial otherness. It's because they are Arab and Muslim that that these things are imaginable and acceptable, and so on. Now I will stop here to give time to the Q&A.
Yeah. So I just want to say a few points to some that I took from you, Ahmed. Thank you so much. The fact of how blood libel and like Western propaganda works, it's actually, it seems that it's a multi-purpose. It has many purposes. In fact, throwing like a false allegation, like beheading babies or stuff of that sort, that becomes like, and if you ask of the logic, they will tell you because they're savages, but actually, in fact, it's the allegation that the main reason of the allegation is to incite this discourse of savagery, and they become both one and the same, like the logic and the quote unquote fact or incident. So that is one thing. But another thing important you mentioned is what I call projection, and you corrected me. This fact is many of these allegations are actually common practices by Western imperialism, and they become camouflaged as allegations onto the other in the process of producing that savage other. A third thing, which I think I raised and you added upon, that it becomes an aesthetic, it becomes an already made image that is believable without fact. It becomes like fill in the blank, and the frame is already put. You just change the Indian face with an Arab face, or it just becomes an already made image that is believable because it has legacies of like centuries. And one last thing about the danger of blood libel is that as you showed, when these rumors spread, that other is dehumanized, and it rids the conversation or the discourse of any material logics. It's not like the operation that spent a year, for example, being planned. I don't know. It becomes just an unconscious moment of like savagery bursting, and it hides the material aspect of there are thousands of prisoners, and that was an attempt to do a prisoner exchange, or in the case of sabotaging trains, they just did it because they were fed up, and there is no mentioning of how that was a strategic sabotaging of imperialist trade. The same with hijacking planes. Like they just hijack planes because they're like fed up, and it's like not because it's Israel who started this trend of hijacking planes. So, and in the case of what you mentioned actually about the rape allegations and how they become weaponized in actually like, and white feminists are like somehow enabling this. Like it actually, this becomes a discourse, a very misogynist and sexist discourse towards the vulnerable woman. And it's not just that it creates the other who's the Arab savage or the gorilla, the gorilla animalistic savage, or the lion, or that's one aspect, but it's also showing whatever the victim, the white victim who's weak, and that enables a very, very dangerous discourse. How can we like it creates a false problem, this rape threat that is coming to the West, and we hear that a lot. Like that's what Zionists tell any pro-Palestine white person: you're supporting this right now, wait for it until it comes to you in the US. That's a logic that they always say. So it's creating this false threat of rape, and then it creates the need, and the solution of it in imperialist discourse is, how can we empower these women? We make them join the army, and then we see the scenes like the all-women tanker, for example, and forgetting the material aspect, that actually you have a boss over there, you have many women who are like conscripts, that just the nature of like, there is material reasoning behind that. Just it's not just feminism. The case of the US Army. The US Army is known as the highest employer of trans people. And this is celebrated as also a victory of some sort, or like progressive an army. And there's no, that also hides the material fact that trans people are the least, that they're not finding job anywhere. Like all the other jobs in the US are rejecting them. So that becomes, so these libels, these lies, they of course produce the other as savage, but by doing that, they also rid any material reasonings and logic behind what resistance one can take. But thank you, Ahmed. I think we can open it for Q&As. I'm happy to read your question in the comments if you would like, but also if you would like to raise your hand or tell us your question, you can unmute yourself. And we have more than half an hour, like 35 minutes left, that we can take questions in.